Hi everyone, thanks for coming today, thanks for having me. My name's Emma O'Leary. I'm going to talk to you today about next steps for workplace culture and gender equality. I'm a consultant for the ELAS group and a solicitor at Essential Solicitors. The ELAS group has specialised in employment law for over 20 years now, but as you can see, we've grown and progressed into a whole range of business support services. My own expertise, though, is in employment law. I deal with a wide range of clients, from very small companies to large corporations. Their problems are fundamentally the same, but the magnitude of their issues and their approach and attitudes vary greatly, particularly when it comes to dealing with gender equality and discrimination generally in the workplace. If we start with the Equality Act, I'm sure everyone here is familiar with what that is and the protected characteristics that it protects. There's 9 protected characteristics, as we can see here. Age, when you belong to a particular age or range of ages, young people, old people, middle-aged people. Sex, fairly straightforward, sexual orientation. Disability, and that's the legal meaning of disability, not a medical definition. Religion or belief, marriage and now civil partnership, race, gender reassignment, and that's right from when you decide to identify as a transgender person. You don't have to have taken any operation or gone through any legal process. It's when you decide as an employee that you want to identify. Pregnancy and maternity. The Equality Act tells us it's unlawful to discriminate against someone because of any particular protected characteristic. And there's different types of discrimination that come under the Equality Act. With comparators, it used to be that you would need a comparator to compare yourself to, so someone without the protected characteristic that you're complaining about. That's no longer the case. You can have a hypothetical comparator. In some situations, you don't need a comparator at all. For example, in a case of direct discrimination, if you directly discriminate against someone, you don't need to show that you've been compared. You compare yourself to someone that's been treated better than you. It's enough to say that you've been directly discriminated against. The other types of discrimination, direct discrimination is where you, for example, you might be overlooked for promotion because your employer thinks you're likely to start a family soon. That would be sex discrimination, it would be discrimination on the grounds of your marital status, possibly pregnancy discrimination if you're at that stage. So it's a fairly obvious category. Indirect, so technically the treatment that you receive might be equal to everybody receives the same equal treatment, but it has a negative effect on you with having this particular characteristic. So for example, a new rota is introduced into a business that requires everyone to work every single Saturday. This will particularly disadvantage employees who are practicing Jews and who observe Saturday as a religious day. The employer may have a defence, and the only category of discrimination you might have a defence to is indirect discrimination. So if you have a criteria, provision or practice which disadvantages a certain group, but you can justify it as being a legitimate aim of a proportionate means, then you might be able to have a defence to that. Associative discrimination is where perhaps if your child had a disability and you have a lot more time off work than other people, but your employer still applies absence monitoring to you and they perhaps take disciplinary action against you, because you're associated with someone with a disability, you might be being treated less favourably. So that is another category of discrimination. Harassment is the crux of which is unwanted conduct, but we will explore that a little bit later. Perceived discrimination is also a category, though it's not on here. But for example, I've seen cases myself where people have brought a claim because somebody picked on them, treated them less favourably because they thought they were gay, for example. Now that person doesn't have to be gay to claim discrimination on those grounds. Subconscious discrimination. There was a case called Geller and Yeshurun Hebrew Congregation where there was subconscious discrimination found. So even though there was nothing obvious, the tribunal found that actually it was in the contemplation, this was a sex discrimination case, and it was in the contemplation of the employer. There was this background thing about marital status and how she was perceived, and that was actually found to be discriminatory. So it's the subconscious. The tribunal found that it must have been in the employer's mind. victimisation, I'm sure we've all seen this. You've got an employee who says they've been picked on and they've been victimised, and it's a mislabelling. More often than not, it is a mislabelling, because actually the legal sense of victimisation is where somebody is treated less favourably because they've made some sort of complaint or grievance or even brought tribunal proceedings relating to a protected characteristic, and then they suffer a detriment because of that, because of bringing. So even if somebody raises a complaint that they feel they've been discriminated against, if we then dismiss them because of it or treat them any less favourably, that would be victimisation, in addition to the possible direct or indirect discrimination they've initially complained about. That's the Equality Act in a nutshell, and something I'm sure we've all heard about and I know has been talked about at this exhibition is the gender pay gap. The very fact that these regulations were introduced was a leap forward, really, because it was recognised by the government that the gender pay gap exists. So these regulations were brought in 2017. And apparently there has been a 0.5% reduction in the gap as of since 2017, but there's still 78% of companies that have a gap that favour men. So is it a leap forward? Will this continue? Will we eventually eradicate it? That remains to be seen. It's still really early days. And we do see these huge pay gaps still, and it's absolutely these regulations and the reporting have revealed that it definitely exists, but the overwhelming pay gap can be justified in some cases, and it's important to read the reports that go alongside the actual statistics to see if there's any justification for it. For example, EasyJet have a pay gap of 45.5%, and they're 9th on the list of the worst offenders, really. They say it's not because we pay men more, it's because predominantly the highest paid people are pilots, and pilots are paid more. So it's not that we simply just pay two members of cabin crew, male and female, differently. That's not the case, and you will find that a lot. But then there's also the case of, well, if pilots are predominantly men, what are we doing about trying to bring more female pilots in? So a lot of these reports you will see will try and justify that gap in that way, but they should also, and I have seen some that do, say, well, but this is what we're doing to tackle it, because I think that's going to be important too. So we're still a long way to go, but we are, in my opinion, I think we're getting there, because we're seeing there is a pay gap, it does exist, but we are trying to tackle it. So we just need to do the work to really get rid of it. Apparently, quite a few companies still haven't produced their pay gap, and it remains to be seen what will happen with that. Now, the legislation itself doesn't have any repercussions, technically, but it does make it an unlawful act, and then it's down to the EHRC to pursue it. So I don't know of any cases yet where they have pursued it and what they will do if they do catch anyone that's doing it. But it will be interesting to see. But otherwise, more it's the media interest, the reputational consequences that are going to be. For example, EasyJet, I think Virgin were one as well, Virgin Money. So it's having the media interest that's really focusing employers' minds. In terms of the worst offenders, there's an online market research company that has a 94% gap. So I don't know what their justification was. It didn't really seem to be one, but that was quite, I don't think you could ever justify that in the same way that an EasyJet case would. I don't think you could say that an online market research company doesn't seem to be any way that you would have predominantly men that are paid more. The sector, not surprisingly, I think, overwhelmingly the finance sector and construction have the biggest pay gaps. And again, that's because there are more men in those jobs, and it remains to be seen if they will try and tackle that. I know PricewaterhouseCoopers, for example, are trying to put measures in place to encourage women to apply for higher roles, because what they found was a trend that if men didn't feel they had the skills for a certain job, they didn't really recognise it, they would just go for the job anyway, whereas women would be more perhaps self-conscious and not apply for the job. So one of the measures they've put in place is to try and tackle that and try and encourage women or identify women who would be good for promotion and get them to apply for those promotions regardless, and more put that in place so that there are more women in top earning jobs. The Asda case, I don't know, I'm sure people are aware of it, was 27,000 store workers who said they carried out work of an equal value compared to their colleagues in distribution centres who are predominantly male. So the people in the Asda stores would be predominantly female, distribution workers predominantly male, and are paid a higher wage. Now, what Asda said, well, it's a completely different job for a start, but what the tribunal found was that actually no, the work was of equal value and they should be paid equally. Asda have gone to the Court of Appeal on that and we await the judgment, but I don't see it going in Asda's favour at this point. So that's now opened the floodgates. Morrison's is the latest, Sainsbury's, Tesco's gender pay gap's actually only 8.6%, whereas the national average is 18.4%, but yet they could face a £4 billion bill if they also lose this store workers v distribution centres case. So it's one to watch out for generally, really. Practical steps that you can take, well, pay staff equally seems the obvious one, but it is about having a look at why there is a gender pay gap and encouraging women into the higher paid jobs, because it does seem that there isn't so much of men being paid more, it's more that women are not in higher jobs, so it's that needs to be addressed. So it's a good idea in practice to look at even if you're not obliged to report any gender pay gap or look at those statistics yourself, I think it's probably a good idea and prudent for you as a company to know where you're at from a HR point of view as well. Can you tackle any equal pay claims? Is there a gender pay gap? Is there something that you need to look at in your workplace to look at this issue, to look at whether you have a gender pay gap and what can you do about it? Sexual harassment. The Time's Up campaign, #MeToo campaign, obviously it's something that we're hearing about an awful lot these days. I personally don't think it's because more cases are on the rise. I think it's more that women or any victims, male and female, are willing to come forward now and not tolerate what seems to have been tolerated in the past. Harassment under the Equality Act is prohibited conduct on the grounds of any protected characteristic, but specifically Section 26(2) of the Act covers unwanted conduct of a sexual nature. An employer has a duty of care to its employees, and the law guides us as to the specific duties that those are. No employer can defend a claim of discrimination and harassment if it can't demonstrate that you took reasonable steps to prevent it. So all employers do need to be aware of their duties and show that they've got the policies in place for equality and diversity, harassment, grievance procedures, disciplinary procedures to tackle it. So with all of this in place and the laws in place, and in theory all employers have these policies, why did the Forces Society report last year say that over 50% of women admitted to being sexually harassed at work and 1/5 of men? Because we do focus on women a lot, but of course men can be victims of sexual harassment too. So why is that? In my opinion, and having advised on this extensively to a number of clients and had tribunal issues on it, it's the entrenched attitudes of some, and we don't want to blanket everybody, but it's some employers, some managers, male and female, that fail to recognise and protect employees from harassment. So they don't comply with their obligations under the Act and their general duty of care to employees. And that's where I think the difficulty lies, because there was calls to change the law and make it more robust, but I think the law's there. The law is there in theory under the Equality Act. It's implementing it, it's educating employers. That's where the work is still to be done. And in some cases, it's because employees and managers don't always know what constitutes harassment. There's the obvious touching, groping, or the more subtle, just consistently commenting on someone's appearance. If that's unwanted and that's creating a hostile, intimidating environment for another member of staff, that's harassment. One of our clients had a manager send in a live Facebook feed of him pleasuring himself, and he didn't really think that would be harassment. In fact, he said, "Oh, didn't think you'd get that." That's a really obvious act of harassment, and we'll laugh, but that certainly created an unwanted hostile environment for the employee receiving it. I had another case where my client was the owner of a business, and he had a long-standing employee who accused him of sexual harassment over an extensive period of time. commented on her, everything from commenting on her appearance just looking nice today, which might seem innocuous at first, but then right down to what sexual positions she preferred. So, and this was an extended campaign over a lot of years, she said. And him and his wife presented a very united front. Well, this is absolutely outrageous, completely deny it. And then I arranged a meeting with him to discuss the defence and how we move forward with the tribunal. And he made a slightly inappropriate comment to me that made me realise, actually, this guy just doesn't get it. So I began to doubt the veracity of this defence he was putting forward, and that eventually settled for quite a large sum. So that particular perpetrator is what some people would seem as old school. He's typical of the ingrained view that it was okay, it's a different time, it's not really harassment, it's just, I'm just saying she looks nice. But it was obviously quite more sinister. And in that case, he was the owner of the business was the harasser, but if one of his managers had been the harasser, he would absolutely have failed to recognise it, failed to understand, definitely wouldn't have had the right policies and procedures in place. And even if he did have just basic policies on paper, he would never have implemented them because he just didn't get it. It was a different time for him. And he's atypical of that attitude that we need to eradicate so that women don't, there's not 50% of women and 25% of men that report feeling sexually harassed at work.
Can you get a button or mic to tweet the live?
If you don't have, I've jumped a slide a little bit there, but if you don't have the appropriate policies at work, the consequences are dire, basically. You can be vicariously liable for the acts of your employees. So if you fail to have the appropriate policies in place and fail to show that you've taken all reasonable steps to prevent harassment, then you will be vicariously liable for those actions. Whereas your defence, if you can show you've done everything possible and one of your employees still goes rogue, then you'll have the defence that we did everything we could, but he just went off on his own and did this. And of course he can be named as a respondent to tribunal proceedings anyway, so there can be personal liability attached to the harasser or the discriminator. It's not just that, there's the tribunals obviously, and the compensation is uncapped in discrimination cases, which we'll come on to. And the media reputation, there's nothing more than the local press or even the national press in some cases, like more than what they see as a juicy sexual harassment story. And the tribunal's an open forum, it's there for the public to attend, and you will see the media there in those kind of cases. And these are the kind of cases that I mean. In the first one, Miss Lokova received 3.2 million. Now, she was in the financial sector, so some of that would have been loss of earnings, and her earnings would have been quite high. And what the tribunal found was that her employer subjected her to a harassment, victimisation and sex discrimination. Her direct manager was found to have called her Little Miss Cokehead. She was unstable, bonkers, commented on her chest area, to the tune of 3.2 million. So there are huge consequences, and of course it's everywhere, it's in the public forum, it's terrible for this bank. In the BAE Systems one, again, huge business, some would say reputable business, but yet this Marion Konchak was awarded £360,000, and the Court of Appeal said she deserved every penny. And there was a sustained campaign in this case as well, and the level of discrimination led to her suffering quite a severe mental illness that partly aggravated the damages she was awarded, and that's why it was so high, because it was reasonable for the employer to know that this would cause her that. Things like her line manager saying that women take things more emotionally than men, who tend to forget things and move on. That on its own maybe is still discriminatory, but it was everything that went after it, and this sustained campaign. And the more that happens and the less you do to prevent it, the higher those damages will go, because it becomes aggravated. And because personal injury can be included in tribunal awards, that obviously escalates the cost to you as well. The case of Steele there, £26,000. She was a short service employee, but her boss had kept repeatedly calling her in a drunken state, saying he was in love with her and wants to do certain things to her. And And it only happened a couple of times, and she resigned and claimed constructive dismissal and sex discrimination, and that was the result, £26,000. Pretty small business, that would have had a huge impact on them. So the next step for workplace cultures, what do we do about this? How do we eradicate this? Because this will always go on. There's already resources available, ACAS, the Equalities Commission, places like ELAS that can advise you, tell you what to do, get you the right policies in place, but it's all about the education, requiring employers we actually need to require them to use these tools. Don't pay lip service to the policies that you have in place and say, tick, yep, we've got harassment, tick, yep, we've got a grievance policy. That's not enough. You need to train your managers in identifying what is harassment, what to do about it. You need to train the staff on not doing it in the first place, but equality and diversity training, not just harassment but discrimination generally, of course. Have your managers, and I think the managers are the most important, but it does go from the top down. Even in the case of, bearing in mind, it does start at the recruitment stage, and that unconscious bias can seep in. So it's having measures in place at that point and the training at that point as well. So that the company doesn't have a position of we don't just tolerate. We don't tolerate it. We see that all the time. We don't tolerate. We've got these policies in place, but do you? It isn't enough. You have to commit to steps that you'll take to handle the complaint, train the staff in what's expected of them, and ensure that anyone experiencing harassment knows that they need to raise it and they'll be afforded protection if they do, and that the company will take it seriously. Some companies have employee feedback surveys, so because some people might be reluctant to approach you directly, but if there's an employee feedback survey that you may periodically issue, there might be something in there that identifies as a problem in the workplace, and it's a good idea then for you to then start any investigation and really trying to tackle the issue. And the old office banter, it's difficult. It's commonplace. We're not robots. We should be building relationships with our colleagues and staff, but there is a line, and that's why it's important for managers to try and nip that in the bud and tackle it head on, so it doesn't escalate. Look at the warning signs. It doesn't escalate. We've got Christmas coming up. You'll see a million articles between now and January, I'm sure, on this Christmas party season, sexual harassment in the workplace extending to Christmas parties, and you don't want to be a killjoy, but at the same time the repercussions for you as an employer and for the victims of this kind of discrimination are worse. So there's got to be a balance there. We just need to foster respectful relationships to sort of try and eradicate what's going on. That's all I have to say. Does anyone have any questions? There's a question. I think you're supposed to get a microphone. You can just shout. Oh, she's coming now with a mic.
Again, sorry.
Just here.
Thanks. More than I'd like, but a few of my clients at the moment, it's more about them getting into work, and my trans and non-binary clients, and noticing even at their interview stages that they're getting misgendered during their interview. And that they're clearly having a bias against them, and obviously they don't know where to take it, because it's not a tribunal thing, because they're not in the place of work, but it's affecting their employability because of the attitudes just in the interview room. Is there anywhere I can guide them legally with that?
So is this when they're applying for a job?
Yeah. So I mean, that's why I run a social enterprise that helps LGBT plus communities get back into work, and through the workshops that I've been doing, I've identified that when they're going into the interview room and they're realising that this person's transgender, or perhaps even non-binary in a couple of situations, there's them like old school comments of, what's your name before? Are you sure you're going to fit in? What are you going to do with the toilets? Yeah. And or it might be, is it Sam then, or is it the misgendering stuff, and then there's kind of been this awkwardness, and then they've not got the role, and they've got no proof, as you wouldn't, that isn't why they got the role, but they can sense from even just from the atmosphere, the way that they're being treated in the interview process, or in sometimes induction processes from like line managers, that it is an issue with their gender identity. But I I do a lot through the coaching side of it, but I'm wondering if there is any kind of legal standpoint that I could say to them, look, I know that this isn't a matter of taking these people to a tribunal, but
well, you could take them to a tribunal.
You could.
If you fail to get a job and you think it's because of some form of discrimination, you can bring a claim in the Employment Tribunal under the Equality Act.
Okay.
Before you get a job, so you can do that.
You can do
that. Yeah. It is difficult because how do you prove? It depends what notes have been made. It might be useful if they make some notes themselves at the interview of what's happened, because it is going to be...
What about if they should record it somehow, or is that...
I wouldn't record it covertly.
Yeah.
But you could ask. Would they mind that if they wanted to say that, you could ask. I think it's probably difficult from the employer's perspective as well, because if you've got someone in saying, can I record this interview, you are going to say, one, I'm not going to do it, and two, I don't want to employ this person. For a start, you are, and that it's going to be difficult to get around that. But I think if they genuinely feel that there has been the reason, and bearing in mind there might be better candidates, so if they feel that really that the transgender was the reason they did not get that job, then they should pursue it to an employment tribunal.
And I think it's not even just about them not getting the job, it's more about them having that harassment of being misgendered, or being comments being made about their gender identity or their sexuality during the interview process. That's kind of harassing anyway.
It is, yeah.
So there is a legal standpoint there that I can...
There is a legal standpoint, yeah, the Employment Tribunal.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, you commented earlier that PwC are trying to encourage female applicants and female promotions. How are they doing that?
Honestly, I don't really know. But they reported that they were putting measures in place. What they said was they were training managers, so it was more about rather than encouraging female applicants, I'm not sure what they're doing there, but internally encouraging them for promotion. So they were training managers on identifying female members of staff that would be good for promotion, and encouraging that dialogue with the female member of staff to ensure that she didn't feel, because they'd identified this self-consciousness that females felt they were underskilled for a particular promotion, and saying, well, actually, you're not, we think you'd be really good for this job and want you to apply.
And I guess that's the easy option, the internal, because you're in control of that. What I was wondering if anyone had any ideas on how to attract external female candidates.
I'm not sure. It's difficult because you can positively discriminate, we know that, but doing that in the sense that if you had a female candidate favouring her over a male candidate just because she was female, that's probably not going to work. That's not going to work from an equality point of view. I'd rather
run an initiative that encouraged strong female candidates rather than positively discriminating.
Yeah, and there's a boundary there as well, because I can envisage if we had a campaign encouraging strong females, which in theory we should, I can imagine males saying, well, hold on a minute, am I being deprived of this opportunity for this job or this promotion? And so it is difficult. I don't have all the answers, because that's a really difficult one, because you do have your obligations under the Equality Act equally towards men, but at the same time we want to try and get rid of this male-dominated top earners that is occurring as well.
You mentioned social media in one of the points that you made. How can HR teams use social media as evidence, or can they not?
Of evidence of misconduct, of harassment or discrimination.
So if it's happening outside of work, what's the kind of guidelines for evidence in a case?
You can. There is a line, but obviously employees are entitled to a private life, human rights issue. However, if there's quite clear evidence of misconduct that's happening, that's having an impact on the workplace, so if there's bullying on a WhatsApp group between work colleagues, you can use that. You can use Facebook posts. You can. If it's there's also a company disrepute issue as well. If they've got an open Facebook page, for example. But if you get, sometimes you'll get an employee that comes to you with a screenshot of some conversation that was going on last night on Facebook. You can use that as evidence if it does demonstrate some kind of misconduct. Any employment tribunal, or it's going to say, the employment tribunal is not particularly going to be concerned too much with the private life and human rights issue. That's going to be a separate argument for which the tribunal aren't going to have jurisdiction. So for them, for a misconduct issue, if you're looking at dismissing someone or disciplining, you can do that. There's provisos to that, but by and large, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I think that's all. No more questions? Okay, thanks very much. Thank you.